Hello, everybody, and welcome to a live reaction edition of the Saints Insider Podcast. I'm Zach Ewing, along with our Saints beat writers for the Times-Picayune and NOLA.com. That's Matthew Paris and Luke Johnson. No rest for the weary, guys. 2 days after the Super Bowl, a full week of covering Chiefs, Eagles, all the things that had to do with the Super Bowl being in New Orleans. And we knew this was going to happen. Here we are, less than 48 hours after the game, and the Saints have finalized a deal to hire Kellen Moore, who was coaching in said Super Bowl. So it's been a whirlwind, but also kind of something we expected.
Yeah, and I'm jealous of Matt, who got to spend the entire week hanging out with the new Saints head coach and building a relationship with him early while I was covering the Chiefs. Way to go, Matt, for picking the good team.
Just as it happened. I mean, I think by day 3, he was tired of seeing my face and the rest of the New Orleans crew, who was just around him constantly. But it was a good opportunity to build FaceTime around him, get some FaceTime. But it also, he did kind of map out a vision, even if it wasn't necessarily an opening press conference for him.
Yeah, I mean, I think I said this last week, but I was impressed with how he handled it, because it was an awkward situation where everybody kind of knew that he was probably the guy in New Orleans. And certainly if he wanted the job, he was the guy in New Orleans. And yet he had the biggest game of his life to get ready for. He could have sort of shirked away from all of that attention and said, I'm not going to comment on that, and kind of gotten reclusive about it. Like there's certain coaches I'm thinking of who have coached the Saints recently who probably would have reacted that way. But he took everything with a smile on his face, without saying anything, because he's not really allowed to say anything, but also very obviously kept the focus on the Eagles and led them to a great performance on Sunday.
He did, and his performance was going to be the ultimate judge of that, of, all right, how is the Eagles offense going to perform with all these distractions? And they passed the test. It was really impressive what he was able to do tonight, or the other night, for them.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And, from the Saints perspective, Luke, this is what a lot of people wanted. It's a clean break from the Sean Payton, Dennis Allen, Drew Brees era. It's a young coach, quite different than anything they've had since Sean Payton got here. He's an offensive mind. In a lot of ways, it's funny because they're trying to break away from that era by almost recreating that era and hiring this young hotshot offensive mind and seeing if they can get lightning to strike again.
Yeah, I remember actually when Sean stepped down in 2022, we're putting together a list of candidates. I had Kellen Moore on there. They didn't end up interviewing him for the job, but I had him on there, and it's just like, well, the last time the Saints tapped a up-and-coming young offensive mind from Dallas, it worked out pretty well. Obviously, like, Moore's had 2 stops in between from his Dallas days. He spent 1 year with the Los Angeles Chargers, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. That may bear some fruit on this year's staff. And then he spent 1 year with the Philadelphia Eagles. And in a lot of ways, it's very similar to the hire of Sean Payton. He's a little bit younger, but he's somebody who comes in here as a highly regarded offensive mind, a young coach, and is somebody who can put his own stamp on a place, much in the way Sean Payton did. And Sean Payton, it wasn't just that he was a brilliant play caller. Like he pushed all the right buttons culturally within the organization. And Kellen Moore is going to get a chance to do that. He's going to get a chance to make this his own thing. And we're probably going to see some different things around here. I mean, since I've been covering the team, I started covering the team in 2018. Everything looked exactly the same all the time because they had the exact same voices. Even if Sean stepped down, they had Dennis Allen, who'd spent a lot of time here as a defensive coordinator, stepping right in, and they ran practice the exact same way. Everything looked similar. It's going to change now, and I think that's probably a good thing for the organization.
Yeah, and he's able to, a lot of the time, a lot of the questions he faced in the last week was, can you command a room? How do you do that? Like, because he's a quieter guy by nature, but a lot of what his players said was his attention to detail, explaining why you need to be in this spot versus that spot, him understanding every aspect of the game, and just that people described him as a brilliant football mind. And I think for football players, that does a lot to capture their attention.
Yeah, I think it's clear that his Eagles players were sold. And that's easy to say. I mean, they were in the Super Bowl, but it also had only been 1 year. And I think in our position, you kind of get used to whether an answer is actually meaningful or whether a guy is just sort of giving lip service to it. Nobody's ever going to say anything negative about their coach, especially in a Super Bowl setting. But I got the impression that these Eagles players in just one season had really grown to like working with Kellen Moore. They thought he was a big part of their success. And I think there's reason for Saints fans to be excited here. Like, this is a guy who clearly has shown he can work with different types of quarterbacks. He worked with Dak Prescott. He worked with Jalen Hurts. He did work the 1 year with Justin Herbert, which didn't work out as well, although Herbert was hurt for most of that year. So you almost want to give him a mulligan on that. But Luke, what are some of the reasons Saints fans should be excited just from the X's and O's standpoint?
I mean, I think the most obvious one is that he's a guy who had a reputation as somebody who's kind of like the passing game guru. When the Cowboys were racking up all these stats while he was there, a bunch of top 10 offenses, top 10 scoring offenses. 2021, they led the league in both total and scoring offense. I mean, they were slinging the ball all over the yard. And I think that's what a lot of people expected him to do in LA when he was there with Justin Herbert. Then he gets to Philly, and they've got some really great passing weapons there. But he recognized that he had arguably the best offensive line in football, and I think without question the best running back in football at his disposal, plus a running quarterback. The guy's run for 50 plus touchdowns. And he recognized that early in the year, and he completely changed what he normally does. And he leaned hard on those guys. Saquon Barkley led the NFL in rushing attempts this year. They leaned on it. And I think that's really good to see. If you were looking for somebody who is a good offensive mind, you were looking for somebody who knows how to take advantage of the skill players at his disposal, of the team at his disposal. Sean Payton did that for a long time. Yes, he had Drew Brees, but you remember that 2017 season when they really started their great run at the end of Sean Payton's tenure. It's like, well, we have Alvin Kamara and Mark Ingram and a good offensive line. And they stopped throwing the ball 50 times a game, and they started leaning into the run game. I think that to me, more than the X's and O's, just the innate understanding of what you got and what you do well and how to marry your offense to that. I think that's exciting to me.
Yeah, I think that's why he became a candidate, truthfully, again, is because, you look at his tenure with Dallas. He was in 2022, he interviewed with 4 different teams. In 2023, it was quieter. Last offseason, he interviewed for the Chargers job, but they didn't hire him. They hired Jim Harbaugh. But because he's able to make his personnel work, and because the Philly offense looked pretty different than his Dallas days, especially in terms of tendencies, I think that willingness to change and the willingness to adapt is what kind of teams look for. And I think it's a really convincing case on why he should be hired, given this Saints search and how long and complicated it was.
And I think to add on to that, it wasn't just throughout the season. It was in the biggest game of the year. Kansas City completely clamped down on Saquon Barkley. And I said on your show, Zach, on many other appearances over the week, if the Chiefs can keep Saquon to a reasonable performance, something less than 100 yards, they're probably going to win. I think Saquon averaged right around 3 yards carry, maybe less, and they shellacked him because Jalen Hurts was finding his guys in the passing game. That was there for him when they needed it. I think Kellen Moore had a lot to do with that.
Yeah, it was 57 yards on 25 carries. But this is there. I also saw an interesting tweet from Pat Thurman of Establish the Run fantasy site out there. But Kellen Moore's offenses and the years and the 6 seasons he's been coordinator, 4 in Dallas, 1 with the Chargers and 1 with the Eagles. Top 10 in no huddle rate every year. Top 10 in neutral pace every year. Top 10 in offensive plays per game every year. Top 10 in points per game 5 of the 6 years. Top 10 in yards per game 5 of the 6 years. So he's really built an impressive resume, even at different spots with different personnel.
Yeah, that sounded like a Sean Payton stat right there. Seriously, like, yeah, I remember writing all those those career obits for Sean Payton when he stepped down here. And it was like, yeah, he had 11 or 12 top 10 offenses in 15 years as the head coach and the offensive play caller. Look, that's really, really hard to do, especially when you consider just over the course of any NFL season, and as we are certainly aware of here in New Orleans, like, you lose good players. One of those Cowboys years, they lost Dak Prescott. You go into a game without Alvin Kamara or your top receivers or whatever, and to consistently do it year in, year out, it's really hard to do. So I think we can, even if the Saints have some big roster turnover this year, and maybe this is going to be a rebuilding year, I think we could probably expect their offense to look at the very least competitive.
Yeah, I see some of the comments out here. Christopher says now get rid of Carr, and Crazy Hoodad says trade Carr to the Jets, and Donald Wood says put together a great staff. Look, we're going to get to some of that, what the next steps are here. But I do want to mention something that you talked about for a second there, Matt, and that's sort of the process. I mean, this was a long process. The Saints were the second team to have an opening during the season after only the Jets. And they were by far the last team to hire. Now, part of that is because they were waiting on Kellen Moore to finish coaching in the Super Bowl. So it's not just like the Saints were dragging their feet. There was a reason behind it. But ultimately, do you feel like they landed in the right place here? I mean, Kellen Moore was not like, I went back and looked at our first hot board in November and said, here are some of the candidates. And his name wasn't on there. His name was only an afterthought even in early January when we started talking about, there was Aaron Glenn, there was Ben Johnson, there was Joe Brady. Later, there was Mike McCarthy. There was always the possibility of Darren Rizzi maintaining the head coaching job. Kellen Moore was a little bit of a latecomer to this process. That doesn't necessarily mean this is the wrong choice, but how do you evaluate the Saints process here?
I think it was thorough. I mean, look, this was a challenging situation for any coach, and I think Kellen Moore is going to have his challenges. That this was not an appealing job, and I think you saw that with the way the process unfolded. But the Saints can't control that as much. I mean, could they have made a harder push for Aaron Glenn? I don't know, but I think they have to be more than happy with the type of coach that they landed, and he's more than qualified. And I think you can still be okay. I've said this on the show before, but it reminds me of last year with the Washington Commanders they were the last team to make a coaching hire. Their fans weren't very excited about Dan Quinn. I think in this case, actually, Saints fans are more excited about Kellen Moore than Commanders fans were about Dan Quinn last year because they wanted Ben Johnson. But I just think with the way it's unfolded, I think they landed a really positive coach. And just because Mike McCarthy dropped out, I've been saying I don't know if Mike McCarthy dropped out because the Saints weren't interested or he could tell that Kellen Moore was going to get the job. I do think he emerged in this process.
Yeah, I do think the Saints are going to have, if they're not having honest conversations themselves about how this search went, that's a problem, right? Joe Brady declined to even do a second interview. Mike McCarthy, I think Matt's right on that. There's probably some more layers to that story, just of the fact that the Saints were kind of dragging their feet on bringing him in-house. Maybe the interest was never as high as we kind of assumed it would be, but still, taking his name out of consideration when that was the last job open, I think that raises some eyebrows. Aaron Glenn taking the Jets job before even taking a visit here raised some eyebrows. So, the Saints have this feeling that they are still in a good spot, and that the problems that everybody else thinks are problems aren't problems. But I think they have to evaluate that. They have to use this coaching search and the aspects of it. Even if Kellen Moore was somebody who was on their radar the entire time as somebody who they really, really liked and one of their top two candidates, because we don't know. I think the fact that people pulled out needs to drive some conversation in that building. And they need to understand that they are not as highly regarded around the league as they are within their own building. And there's got to be some reconciliation about that.
This is where the Moore hire is so interesting, is because can he make those steps to repair their reputation? Like, if they get rid of Derek Carr and let's say they have a journeyman quarterback, pick a name, Justin Fields, and if he gets Justin Fields toward above average quarterback play, like that'll do a lot to restore, like, oh, New Orleans has a quarterback now, or, oh, they have a vision. Like, it'll be really interesting to see what Kellen Moore's vision is. He talked a lot about tempo in his press conferences throughout the week. I think that's something he's probably going to hammer home in his opening press conference. And we'll see, but you can't go wrong with the exciting young offensive coordinator. I mean, so many teams have tried to replicate it, and sometimes it does go wrong. Let's be clear, but it's not a bad path to try and explore.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think this is a really good hire. I think if Moore would have turned him down, I think they would have had some serious questions, right? But ultimately, you land on a 36-year-old coach who has done nothing but be successful as an offensive coordinator, and you're talking about like some of the premier coaches in the NFL have kind of been on that path, right? Or at least somewhat on that path. Kevin O'Connell, Sean McVay, very young, bright offensive mind. Kyle Shanahan, same deal. Even Kevin Stefanski. I know that the Browns have been a disaster the last couple of years. That's a 2-time Coach of the Year. I think this has potential to go really well if they can get everything else in line behind him.
And I do. His star did cool in 2020 after that 2022 season. Like, I actually think it's a good thing that he didn't rush into becoming a head coach. One of the more interesting moments I had with him in this past week was, I didn't realize, had forgotten until I was doing research, that Boise State wanted him to come back and coach in 2021. Like, near the end of the 2020 season, they wanted him badly, I think. The 2020 Dallas Cowboys were pretty injured. There was an opportunity for him to be a head coach at such a relative young age, and he said thanks but no thanks to his alma mater and stuck with the NFL and had some bumps and bruises after that. And I think it's a good thing to kind of go through those down moments a little bit. I mean, just look at the Eagles, after flaming out last year, that they won the Super Bowl this year. Like, I do think that adversity has kind of helped make him prepared for being an NFL head coach.
Yeah, we are reacting live here on the Saints Insider podcast. Kellen Moore, it's not, I guess, not official yet. The Saints haven't announced it, but it is finalized. We have confirmed Kellen Moore will be the 12th permanent head coach of the New Orleans Saints. And, ending a long process here, but I think that there is some optimism. I saw one of the comments saying that we're being too negative. I don't think we're being negative. We're being realistic here. This has been a long process. And I think
looked it up. It was 99 days. Tomorrow would have been the 100th day of the coaching search.
They should have waited one more day.
Not search, but since they fired Dennis Allen.
Yeah. Which, I mean, the search at least started from a preliminary, like that's when Mickey Loomis pulls his list out of his drawer that every GM keeps and dusts it off and says, okay, who can I cross off and who should I add? And I mean, that's when you start thinking about it. Real briefly, guys, on the 2023 Chargers, because that's really the only like negative mark on Kellen Moore's resume. And it's interesting. We can transition into a discussion about Brandon Staley as a possible defensive coordinator, because he was the head coach on that Chargers team and ultimately got fired late in the season. It was a team that had pretty high expectations. They had made the playoffs in 2022 and then lost a huge lead against Jacksonville in the first round of the playoffs. And so I think the fan base was a little antsy anyway, and it really went downhill. It reminds me a little bit of this past Saints season where things just kind of almost out of control of the head coaches and the coaching staff went awry. Most namely, Justin Herbert was playing with a fractured finger, I think on his non-throwing hand, and he played through that, but he was not all that effective. And then he fractured a finger on his throwing hand and missed the rest of the season. And that's when they lost the game to the Raiders by like 50 something points. I mean, it got ugly at the end of the Brandon Staley era there in LA. But how much do you kind of put that at the feet of Kellen Moore, and how much do you say that's the exception to the rule of an otherwise really good resume?
I think
you tackle that, Matt. Go ahead.
I think the weight of like a franchise's history can get to certain coaches. Like I think the way you mentioned that playoff loss, that really doomed the Brandon Staley era there, and it reminds me of what happened with the Colts and Frank Reich. Frank Reich, I think, is a good coach. I know it didn't work out for him after in Carolina, but you look at that last year with the Colts. They're coming off a disastrous end in the 2022 season, I think, with oh no, I'm sorry, the 21 season. They had an opportunity to make the playoffs with Carson Wentz. Wentz really had a terrible game to end the season against the 2-14 Jags. They lost. They didn't make the playoffs. And then the 2023 season was just like a mess. And I think there was a hangover effect. And I think sometimes you get a hangover effect, even if you try to change things, like bringing in a Kellen Moore. And I just think there was baggage there that was kind of too hard to overcome.
Yeah, and when I look at it, I mean, like you said, Justin Herbert was hurt. They had Easton Stick start 5 games for him that year. The Chargers lost 8 of their last 9 games. A lot of that was with Justin Herbert hurt, and then on top of that, their run game was awful that year. It's one of the worst in football, and yeah, I'm not really worried about that after watching what they did this year, in Philadelphia. I think you got to have the right players, obviously. Philly has a lot of the right players, but I don't look at that as this one glaring weak spot in his resume. I don't look at that as a concern. I think he's a really, really, really sharp offensive football coach, and there's nothing but data to back that up.
And sometimes, like, well-established coaches have just down seasons. Like, I had completely forgot about this until reading it when McDaniels was hired by the Patriots again. But Josh McDaniels was a member of the 2011 St. Louis Rams that went 2-14, and then went with the Patriots, albeit as their offensive coordinator, and was, that did not take away from his coordinator abilities because he was electric with Tom Brady. Now, I realized Tom Brady was probably a lot carrying him in that situation, but I think people still recognize Josh McDaniels as a smart offensive mind. Maybe not head coach material, but that's really going to be the thing. Is Kellen Moore head coach material? And we can talk about Brandon Staley here in a second if they hire him as defensive coordinator, because he's like the leading candidate at this point. Maybe Staley's cut out to be a better coordinator than he is a coach. You just don't know until these things happen.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think that's the one thing you just can't know. And I don't, the 2023 Chargers notwithstanding, let's say Kellen Moore just had the most brilliant resume imaginable, even including that, you still don't know. Dennis Allen's a great defensive coordinator, has not been able to get it done as a head coach. And we've seen that story play out over the league again and again. So let's move into that discussion of who Kellen Moore hires to fill out his staff and kind of the next steps here. You are watching the Saints Insider live reaction. Kellen Moore hired as the next head coach of the New Orleans Saints. Don't know exactly when he'll be introduced. I mean, we've heard that he wants to be part of the Eagles parade on Friday, which means maybe it's Monday before he gets introduced here, or maybe they try to sneak something in before that. But either way, he's going to have had some of these head coaching discussions, or assistant coaching discussions to fill out his staff already. He probably had as of last week. And the names we keep hearing over and over again are, as you guys mentioned, Brandon Staley on the defensive side, and then Doug Nussmeier, his quarterbacks coach in Philadelphia, as an offensive coordinator. Is that ultimately where you expect this to go, Luke, or are there other names you've heard? It's going to happen pretty quickly either way.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Staley thing feels like it's pretty close to barely like barreling toward completion. You know what I'm saying? And I actually really like that hire. Like, it's kind of what you were saying earlier. Yeah, he was not a very good head coach, but he was an excellent defensive coordinator. And I think that I think there's really a need in the Saints building for some new ideas there on defense. I'd be really intrigued to see what that would look like. And then, obviously, like, when you have a play calling head coach, you don't, the offensive coordinator, you're gonna kind of limit what you're gonna get there in terms of what kind of coach you're gonna get in, because there's limitations for career advancement for those guys. They're not going to be calling plays. So, but Doug Nussmeier is a respected coach in the NFL. He's obviously got ties to the Saints organization. He spent 2 years here as a player. His son obviously plays 80 miles up the road and in Baton Rouge. Makes a whole lot of sense for him to be part of that too. You don't like his son's going to be playing one more year there before he's playing professional football. So that's not going to be like too huge of a factor. But I do think his connections to the state, they have a family home in, what was it, Lake Charles, if I remember from Wilson Alexander's excellent story on Garrett before the start of the season. That it makes all the sense in the world for those two to be part of his staff. And then, we'll just kind of see how it plays out from there. But one thing that we know is that they're not going to have much of an opportunity to cherry pick from the old staff. So many of those guys are already in new places. We've got Clint Kubiak and Andrew Janoko and John Benton in Seattle. Derek Foster is in Dallas. Joe Woods and Marcus Robertson, I believe, are both in Las Vegas. And Mike Hodges is in Cincinnati. So really, when you look at what's left, and Darren Rizzi is almost certainly going to be gone too. Yeah, I have to imagine that we'll be hearing at some point in the next 24 hours that he's joining the Denver Broncos staff.
Yeah, we just got a question about that, actually. I would say, I guess it's possible Kellen Moore went to him and said, hey, would you want to stay? But I think we're 90+%.
Darren's kids they're all grown and gone. I think that was part of the reason why he stayed after the last coaching staff turnover here. Even though he didn't get the head coaching job here, is because he had kids in school here. All of his kids are out of high school, and most of them are living in South Florida. So there's no familial reason for Darren Rizzi to stay here, and it would make a lot more sense, I think, for him to join the Denver Broncos staff, work with people he's used to working with.
Yeah, going back to Nussmeier real quick, that's a guy who's followed Kellen Moore throughout his coaching career. Went with him to the Chargers, went with him to the Eagles. Now, the only way that he could leave is a coordinator. Like, I don't think he could come here and be quarterback's coach. In fact, as we're recording this, Nick Sirianni apparently gave a quote he was asked about like Kellen taking staff members with him. He's like, I don't let that happen usually, but sometimes you can't help it. I'm skipping here. And then he went on to talk about how last year, or maybe 2 years ago, Jonathan Gannon brought with him a staff member because he was able to be the defensive coordinator for the Cardinals rather than just like the linebackers coach. Like you can block, like, let's say Kellen Moore wanted to bring the assistant quarterbacks coach to be the quarterbacks coach. You can block something like that, but when it's a coordinator, those rules are different.
Coordinators or head coaches are the only ones you can't block.
Yep.
Saints, I believe, what I heard last year, they tried to hire a different person to be their offensive line coach, but it was blocked because it was an assistant offensive line coach to offensive line. They ended up hiring John Benton. He did a pretty good job, and now he's in Seattle with Clint Kubiak. But yes, Matt is correct. The only way that move cannot get blocked is if they're hiring to become an OC, even if it's OC and really just title only, because he wouldn't be calling plays.
And another name to keep an eye on would be Kirby Moore, the offensive coordinator at Mizzou, who's his brother. I don't know necessarily if it would be for offensive coordinator, but quarterbacks coach maybe, or pass game coordinator. Like, that's a name. I could see them being interested in working together. You're muted, Zach.
Yeah, sorry, guys. That kind of brings to the point. Like, hiring as coordinators is the least complicated part of this, because, like you said, they can't be blocked. He's got some natural candidates. I think we all thought it might be natural he would bring in a guy like Brandon Staley, who has some head coaching experience. You can lean on him for some of the more procedural parts of the job, and how did you do this? How should I do that? What would you change? Those sorts of conversations. But it's filling out those other assistants that may be trickier, because he's only 36 years old. He hasn't been around long enough to have a bunch of connections outside of guys who are already on staffs. So that may be the tricky part. Kirby Moore, certainly a name to look out for. Now, does Kirby Moore, if he's an offensive coordinator at an SEC school at Missouri, does he want to move to the NFL? If he does, maybe he's willing to become a quarterback's coach or a passing game coordinator or something. If he wants to be an OC, he might rather stick where he's at for another year and see if he can be an offensive coordinator in the NFL. I don't know. To me, that's the more tricky part of this is, do you have quality guys to fill out the positions beneath the coordinators on your staff?
Yeah, the upside of hiring a guy who just was in the Super Bowl is they hired a Super Bowl winning coach. The downside is every other team has its coaches in place and has already started assembling their staff. I think it's been almost 3 weeks since the last team who had a vacancy hired their coach. Those teams had a big head start on the Saints, and as we just discussed a second ago, even the guys on the Saints staff have been plucked away and hired elsewhere. So outside of the coordinators, they're going to have a tougher time than others filling the staff. But I think that his age matters less in this, actually, Zach, and his relative inexperience in the NFL because he was working on Mike McCarthy's staff. Mike has spent a couple decades in the NFL. Yeah, he was working with Vic Fangio in Philadelphia, who's spent 40 years working in the NFL. He's got connections to people who have long resumes in the NFL, and I think that he'll have a chance to fill out a decent staff, even though they are kind of behind the 8 ball a little bit here.
And I think that's why the Staley hire would be pretty important for him, is to have a former head coach on staff, someone he can lean on. I'll be fascinated to see the dynamic between those two, given Brandon Staley was his boss, and now the roles are kind of switching. But I think it's to have something experience, like someone to lean on. Like I heard in this process that maybe Ron Rivera was a candidate to be like a assistant here, at least like someone to lean on. But then that did not happen because Rivera is going to Cal to work with and their GM role. But that's something that someone like that, someone you can lean on, someone who has experience and the main job that can guide you throughout the course of a season. I think that's important.
Yeah, 100%. And to be clear, Kellen Moore has a plan for this. Like he's not just starting today and saying, "Oh shoot, who am I going to hire as my wide receivers coach?" I mean, he has a plan for this and probably relayed that plan to the Saints. Does that mean every person he asks is going to say yes or isn't going to have a last minute change of thought? No, it doesn't. But I mean, he knows he has plenty of people and probably has had at least preliminary conversations with them. As far as that goes, maybe the bigger decision and the more important decision is we can start to wrap up here. But like the next thing that happens, and one of our first comments, and y'all can feel free to continue to comment on the YouTube page and hit the like button and the subscribe button while you're down there, all that sort of stuff. But one of the first comments we got as we started this stream like 30 minutes ago was, get rid of Carr, now trade Carr. Getting rid of Derek Carr is complicated for reasons that we'll continue to talk about in the next few weeks. And that's besides the fact that the Saints even want to get rid of Derek Carr, who at this point is probably their easiest path to being competitive in 2025. I mean, I know Saints fans don't like the guy. He has been at worst a league average quarterback for New Orleans. I mean, probably even a little bit better than that. He spent a lot of time injured this year, but he's been pretty good. So the question is, do they want to? And more to the point, the question is, does Kellen Moore want to get rid of Derek Carr? That's going to be the next really major domino to fall here.
Yeah, whenever we talk to him, I'm sure that's going to be a main focus of the conversation because he is going to be the guy pulling the trigger for the quarterback or for the offensive plays that Kellen Moore is calling. I'm sorry. So it's really that ball feels like it's squarely in Kellen Moore's court, right? And he's going to let the people who are making the roster moves for the Saints know what his preference is. If they don't want Derek Carr, and if people get their wish and he's traded or cut or whatever, just know that you're probably in line for a really, really rough year. I mean, more than likely, and maybe that's what they want. Maybe they want to hit that reset button, do the 3-14 thing and get the top 3 pick in next year's draft and reset the quarterback position there. But if you jettison the guy who, yes, has been disappointing, but like to Zach's point, I mean, when he's been on the field with full complement of weapons, he's been pretty good. You're probably just looking at a bad time, just in terms of what that season's going to look like.
I don't know.
And it's Spencer Rattler and Jake Haener went what
0-7.
0-7.
Yeah.
And Rattler was somebody that people were really excited about. I mean, and I don't think Clint Kubiak did a bad job at that offense last year either. It's just, I get it. I get the perspective from the Saints fans. Just know that if you do that, it's probably not going to look good for a year. That's okay too. If you want to do the really hard reset, that might be the best path forward for the team. But as average as he may be as an NFL quarterback, league average, he really raises the team's floor.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And I think, Kellen Moore is the one who has to decide that, and he probably understands what it means to get rid of Derek Carr and what that means for this season. And he's got to be honest with the front office and they with him about what that means. I mean, look, if we reset and start Spencer Rattler for a year, the possibility exists that this is a bottom out year. Roland, I've seen you say this a couple times, get Cam Ward. How much draft capital do you want to use? Because Cam Ward is probably not there at number 9. And that's a lot of, that's a high pick to use on a quarterback when you've got Derek Carr in the building anyway. You probably have to give up more draft capital and move up into the top 5 or 6 to have a chance at Cam Ward. So
I saw somebody propose a fake trade today that was the Saints sending number 9, Derek Carr, and next year's first to go up and get Cam Ward, which and more. There's more to it. I just don't. Personally, I think if Cam Ward was in last year's draft class, he might have been the 5th best quarterback in that draft class. And if Cam Ward was in next year's draft class, he might be the 3rd or 4th best quarterback in that draft class. So and if the Saints do truly suck next year, you're talking about maybe trading a top 10 pick and maybe a top 5 pick for a guy who might not be your answer quarterback. He might, but he might not. I don't know. It's just, it feels like you'd have to trade up into the top 2 to have a chance at him. And it just feels like way too rich for somebody who has a lot of questions.
Yeah, unless the Titans hire Nico Harrison, I don't think they're going to be getting an easy deal to trade up with them for the first overall pick. But, Mickey Loomis, that was one of the things he was clear about in his season-ending press conferences, that the next coach would have a say in the quarterback and that he would determine the direction. So I don't know how he feels about Derek Carr, but you already heard a little bit throughout the process. If that reporting from The Athletic was accurate, then maybe he wasn't as sold on Derek Carr being the quarterback, but we'll see.
Yeah, maybe not. Look, I saw there's a lot of comments coming in. Somebody said Carr is not the future. No, he's not. I mean, he's not the long-term future. But do you want to have a veteran who, again, Beef Cat says we love Derek Carr. We're calling him average. I don't think we're going over the top and loving him here, but he is going to be your best chance at being competitive next year.
Yeah.
And so that's really the question: does Kellen Moore want to go through a year without that floor, where the floor might drop out and you might be 3-14? But if that means you get Arch Manning or you get I'm blanking on who, Drew Aller or one of these guys from next year's draft class, maybe it's worth it. I mean, you better be really sold on Cam Ward if that's going to be the answer this year.
Right. And just last thing on Derek Carr. I mean, yes, if they want to move on from him, they should. Just know that it's, if you move on from him, you're going to have to eat $51 million in cap space this year for a player who's not playing for your team, one way or another. If he's on your team, it's $51 million in cap space. If he's off your team, it's $51 million in cap space. So, if you move on from him, it just has to be with the understanding that you're going to be terrible this year. You have to be okay with that, because they're not going to get a better quarterback for this year's team than Derek Carr. It's just, because they're not going to sign Sam Darnold. Like they don't have the cap space to do that. They could maybe like get really lucky and hit on a retread and find the next Baker Mayfield. But like the chances of that happening are exceedingly slim. The chances of any rookie quarterback in this class being better than Derek Carr are exceedingly slim. So yeah, like he's a middle of the road NFL quarterback, but he's going to cost you $50 million this year regardless. So it just depends on what direction you want to take is all we're trying to say.
Right. And I mean, if you look at the reasons coaches are fired, it's because they can't figure out the quarterback. I mean, hell, even Dennis Allen, maybe one of the reasons he was fired was because they didn't have a quarterback in year one. And then when they got his guy and Derek Carr, it didn't pan out to nearly the level it needed it to sustain winning in the long term. So it's going to be a pivotal moment of Moore's tenure. And even if they punt on it this year, I mean, maybe they should punt it on Carr, honestly, because you would probably have a better shot at having a better direction in year two. But that's where it gets tricky, right? I mean, if you win 4 games or 5, suddenly you win 4 games instead of 3, and you're the 4th pick and you're outside that range, it's really hard to land a quarterback, but you've got to at least have a plan to try and do so. And that's going to be, I think, the defining moment of Moore's tenure early on anyway.
Yeah, just look what happened with the Raiders this year. They were in line to be the number 1 pick, and then did they win back-to-back games? It was Saints back-to-back games, or was that 2 out of 3? And then they find themselves picking right in front of the Saints, number 8.
And to the point of the comments here, Zach, if you want to put up GPs about Jalen Hurts drafted in the 2nd round, Russell Wilson, like those teams, they had Carson Wentz in place. Howie Roseman even called themselves a quarterback factory, which poisoned the well with Wentz. And then Russell Wilson, that same offseason, they signed Matt Flynn. So, I mean, teams take multiple shots at this. You can scout and develop well. It's just much harder to. And that's even why something like Spencer Rattler, it was a good upside swing, but when he got extended playing time to play, it was pretty ugly.
Yeah, I mean, like you can get these guys lower down. We all know Tom Brady was a 6th-round pick. Jalen Hurts was a 2nd-round pick. Like you can do it. It's just it's a lot harder. And that's not to say the Saints should not draft any quarterback this year. Maybe you find a gem you really like lower down. But I saw there was another comment about Shedeur Sanders, like Cam Ward, those guys, if they even happen to fall to number 9, which the recent history of quarterbacks in the draft, they don't fall, they rise. I mean, somebody falls in love with them and you have to go get them if you're also in love with them. And so I just don't know the Saints are in position to do that. And the real question, guys, and Matt, you're I think working on a story about the challenges Kellen Moore faces. I think the overarching question here is what is the appetite in the front office and in the fan base for that hard reset? What if it does mean going 3-14, 4-13, and then even in 2 years, maybe you're only 6-11. But if that means their success 3, 4, 5 years down the road, is there an appetite for that versus just trying to chase the playoffs in like a 10-7 season?
Yes, but this is the reality with the Saints roster is they haven't been 10-7. With Derek Carr, they were 9-8. That's an above 500 record, but they had that season, they got the ball rolling too late and missed the playoffs. Last season, probably that same range, but we're not in it because of a bunch of injuries and couldn't win in the biggest moments. Like this roster has some shortcomings that I think they're going to need to address.
Yeah, I totally agree. They definitely need to get an infusion of young talent, and that's why I'd really have a hard time trading a bunch of current and future assets to go up and get a quarterback, because the reality is they need offensive and defensive linemen. They need another receiver. Yeah, they need linebackers. They probably need some help in the secondary. Like they have holes all throughout this roster, especially when it comes to depth. You get young, cheap impact players to really get out of this. This would honestly, frankly, be a really good year for them to for the first time ever, decide to trade back and acquire some assets. We've seen with a lot of these teams what what having good impact young players can mean, and how quickly that can fuel a turnaround. It's what happened in Philadelphia. It's what happened with the Los Angeles Rams. I mean, those teams are loaded with young players. You look at the Philadelphia Eagles this year. I mean, three of the biggest impact plays, the three of the biggest impact players in that defense that completely dominated that game were Cooper DeJean, second-round pick this year, picked one slot ahead of Kool-Aid McKinstry, by the way. Quinyon Mitchell, who's their first-round pick this year, and Jalen Carter, who was their first-round pick the year before. Jalen Carter, number 10 pick that they acquired from the Saints in the Trevor Penning trade. Cooper DeJean, number 40 pick they acquired from the Saints in the Trevor Penning trade. I mean, like, trade back, collect those assets, make somebody else rue the day they traded you the number 13 pick or whatever, and build from that way up, because they're not going to be able to replenish this talent through free agency, not for a couple of years.
Yeah, it's like, this is not a fantasy draft, right? Like, you can't. I've seen people saying Aaron Rodgers, Dak Prescott, all this kind of stuff. Like, this is not a fantasy draft. The salary cap is real. The Saints are in a pickle. The options are really not that plentiful. JJ McCarthy's an interesting name I saw in there. Like, I don't know what the Vikings would want for him, but again, if you're really in love with him and the Vikings decide to run it back with Sam Darnold, maybe he's a guy. But like, the point is, if you take a big swing like that and give up a lot of assets, you'd better be right. So that's really the bottom line. All right, we're going to wrap things up here. Saints have hired Kellen Moore as their head coach. He is the 12th permanent head coach of the New Orleans Saints. What is your headline overarching on this day? I mean, beyond the obvious of Saints hire Kellen Moore, what do you think is the most important thing to take away, guys? And Matt, we'll start with you.
I was hoping you'd start with Luke, because
you want me to go? I got one ready.
Yeah, you got one. Go ahead, please.
It took a long time, but they got a win. That shouldn't be the print headline. It's not pithy enough, but that's ultimately what it came down to, right? It took almost 100 days for them to find a head coach after they fired Dennis Allen, and it was tumultuous along the way. But when the dust was cleared, like, they got a really good young head coach. They should be very happy with this. I think this will be highly thought of in league circles. You're starting to see all these like grades for teams that hire their coaching staff. I bet the Saints are up there. I think this is a really good hire for a team that has a lot of issues that we've seen put a big damper on this coaching search throughout it. So they should be very happy.
And I've got one. It's the new direction thing that we talked about at the beginning. Yes, maybe they're trying to recreate the Peyton magic. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. But it's also, Kellen Moore will do things differently than Sean Payton as well, just because maybe they're going for the same type of archetype. It's still someone who brings a whole different set of perspectives, and I think that's what this franchise has been missing for a long time. I think is just that new blood, and Kellen Moore provides that.
All right, so we will keep it locked on Kellen Moore here all week. I mean, this is going to be a real truncated offseason, not just because of the Super Bowl, but because of this hire. The NFL Combine's in 2 weeks. 2 weeks from tomorrow, I think it starts, right? So it's, I mean, we're going to have staff hires between now and then. We'll find out when Kellen Moore will be introduced. I would think Thursday is the earliest possible day. I know the Eagles parade is Friday, probably not. So it's either Thursday or maybe Monday of next week that we're going to see Kellen Moore introduced as Saints head coach, and then we'll have assistant coaches, coaching staff, and it'll be into draft season and trying to figure out exactly how it is the Saints will answer those questions we just posed.
Yeah, I'm sure Kellen Moore has access to a private jet right now. He'll be able to get back in Philly and no problem. And sure, I mean, he might be able to buy one after he signs his deal.
He might. That'll be something else that we'll try to find out the compensation. So keep it locked here to NOLA.com/Saints for all the news. We got lots coming, lots of reaction, lots of information, and also here at the Saints at NOLA.com YouTube channel. Hit the like button, subscribe. Thank you all so much for hanging out with us today. Lots of you here, and we know you care deeply, and so we are here to bring you the best coverage. We'll continue to do so. Thank you for watching. and we will see you next time.